Like if you wouldn't listen to it yourself, like, more than one show or for more than whatever, 15 minutes, then you need to really go back to the drawing board. So I think you need to think of like an entertainment company from the content perspective, but then also from the distribution and the marketing perspective.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Ben Decowski. I am the Managing Director of Podcasting here at Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. And today I have Carolyn Walker on the show. Carolyn is the CEO and Managing Partner of Response Marketing, a small but mighty marketing firm based in New Haven, Connecticut. Carolyn's helped McAfee launch a branded podcast, Hackable, which experienced a ton of success out the gate and has worked with brands like AWS, Logitech, Citrix, as well as brands outside of the tech space like Uncle Julio's, Fortina, and Guess Watches. So really runs the gamut. And I wanted to bring Carolyn on to talk about launching a successful branded podcast and how they can help build your brand. Carolyn, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Super happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. I'm definitely been looking forward to this for a while. So before we jump in, podcasting has really exploded over the past few years, but it's not as easy as, just sitting down in front of a mic, hitting record and boom, you've got a successful podcast. So obviously there's, a lot that goes into launching a successful show, but it's not for everyone. So when it comes to, launching a branded podcast, what's your take on who should consider launching one and why?
Yeah, great question. And I think, listen, my first piece of advice is don't jump on the bandwagon. It isn't for everybody. In our case with Hackable, it really fit quite beautifully into McAfee's strategic imperatives to build thought leadership, to build positive customer sentiment, and provide cybersecurity education in a really entertaining way. So I would say, you think about how podcasting fits into your marketing strategy or your content marketing strategy. And if it doesn't, that's okay, but if it does, it is a really powerful vehicle to build brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, what are some of the flip side of that? Then what are some of the challenges or obstacles that marketing teams might face that actually should lead them towards considering, launching a branded podcast?
So I think, listen, and I can tell you about the case of McAfee in particular, and I just think it's a good example.
Hmm.
And so our challenge as marketers of cybersecurity or computer security or what do you want, digital security is that, people put it on their machines and they want to or tend to set it and forget it, right? They don't want to think about, what's going on. They don't want to think about, is this HTTPS or HTTP? They don't want to think about it. They want the software to do everything for them. But what we knew working with McAfee is that the best line of defense anyone can have to protect themselves in any kind of situation in terms of digital threats is education. So education is the single best line of defense, right? But the challenge is that no one cares or wants to have the conversation about it. So as marketers, we were really, we were stumped. We worked with them for many years before we did this podcast, and we tried all kinds of tactics, and some worked better than others. We did funny things, we did entertaining things, we did educational things, and, we would get some engagement, but not really like an overwhelming reply or response. And also McAfee was very challenged with when people were engaging with them, it was when things were going wrong, right? When you were hacked or your identity
Hmm.
was stolen or you were phished or scammed or whatever. And or when their credit card was being charged on the annual basis, right? And so the sentiment about McAfee wasn't really that great. So we had multiple kind of, challenges going on. And we thought about podcasting as a way to really intimately connect in your ears with your audience and create stories that were so entertaining that the audience couldn't help but listen to them. And so for us, that's what it was about. It was like, first, let's be entertaining. Second, let's give them some, thought leadership and protection ideas and get them really engaged with the brand. And so I think, as other businesses or other brands, you can think about what your challenges are and answer the question, is this a good medium for us to solve that challenge in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you hit on something that I think is really interesting there because it is, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, right? I mean, it's something that you don't think about or isn't top of mind until it is, right? Until something happens. And I think we've all been there before, or at least I hope that not everybody's been there, but I think we all have. And one of the things you mentioned there was, being able to kind of share, stories through this podcast and like really trying to generate some interest there and connecting with your audience there. I guess as far as is kind of drumming up some of that interest or getting some excitement around a podcast that, really surrounds a kind of like a subject or a topic that people don't generally think of, you know, how do you come up with some of those stories that think that I guess your audience would really want to hear and stories that are worth sharing? What does that look like as you're trying to launch a show and
Hmm.
really try to make sure that you're bringing some interest and attention and excitement, to the podcast that'll make it fun and, worth
Yeah.
listening to for the listener.
Yeah, well, I'll say first and foremost, like the show structure and format is super important, but to back up for a second,
Mhm.
McAfee really challenged us. They were like, we knew that we wanted to create this really entertaining show. They wanted to have, oh, great, we're going to do a podcast. Let's do what everyone else is doing. Let's get our customers on or our partners on. Let's get Dell on. Let's get Verizon on. And we were like, we don't need another two talking heads. Like we don't need another interview style format. And I'm not disparaging that. I'm just saying for them, like we thought we really needed to break the mold and be more creative in that. And so we really had to pitch them on this idea of doing something very different. And so the structure of the show was what we sold them on, which is essentially think Mr. Robot meets Mythbusters. So we were taking hacks in pop culture like Black Mirror, CSI Cyber, Mr. Robot. We recreated them in the audio format, right? It's like it theater in your ears. It's amazing. And so even if you've never heard or saw Mr. Robot or CSI Cyber or you weren't aware of some of these hacks that were happening in pop culture, we recreated them for you in an audio format in a really entertaining way. And then the Mythbusters part is we put those hacks to the test because as consumers, right, or customers even of McAfee, like how nervous should we really be? We don't know if that hack on Mr. Robot was like, does that really exist? Is it real? Should I be nervous about this? I just bought an IoT toaster and like, can I get hacked through my toaster? And so when we created that structure, the topics became really easy for us, right? It's like, okay, we find all these scenes in pop culture and news, and then we bring in our white hat hackers and we put them to the test. And so the show format really enabled us to, come up with those topics pretty easily and like what the next things were, aligned with what McAfee was talking about, by the way, too, right? Outside of podcasting, what their marketing plans were looking like and lining up with the schedule of what they're out there with in terms of other things they're talking about, right? So maybe they're talking about malware or phishing or all that stuff, so we were aligning those up so that they would dovetail nicely together.
Yeah, no, and again, another interesting point where as far as it's not just launching the show, right? It's how are you going to make this show successful over time? So it's not only just drumming up, interest at the beginning, but you got to be able to keep people coming back and coming back. And there's a number of things that go into that. But I think, when you talk about kind of building around your almost like your content calendar that they already have built down, the
Mm-hmm.
things that are going to be important to them. I mean, that is, I think, extremely helpful in being, creating a successful podcast over the duration of, the actual lifetime of the podcast. So
Definitely.
I guess as far as outside of just, the topics that you're
Mhm.
creating for, the show as it goes on over time, What are some of the other challenges that I guess you've seen, or some of the things that can cause a podcast kind of, stumble or fall down as, it continues to evolve over time to, keep it fresh, keep it exciting?
Yeah, well, I think, listen, we learned a lot of lessons, and I'm sure there's a lot of podcast marketers out there that are learning the lessons too. But one of the lessons that we learned early on was you can't really think like a brand marketer. You have to think about it, all of it, as like an entertainment company. Right. So if it's really well done, and you're, putting some budget into production, and you're really making this thing entertaining, then you don't want to just, throw your money out the window. You really have to like think, like I said, like an entertainment company, and do what you can to promote it as content, like really interesting and engaging content. And, I said before that it really starts with like the show format and the idea and stuff like that. And it really does. And if you don't think you have a strong idea, I would say don't do it, because it's going to be really hard for you to market it and get people to listen to it. Like if you wouldn't listen to it yourself, like, more than one show, or for more than whatever, 15 minutes, then you need to really go back to the drawing board. So I think you need to think of like an entertainment company from the content perspective, but then also from the distribution and the marketing perspective. And so, what does that look like, right? And we were super creative when it came to the marketing side, and we also had tons of commitment from McAfee to put what they could behind the promotion of the show. So, whoever's thinking that you can create a podcast and put an episode out there and thinks people are going to flood to it is mistaken. You're competing out there with millions of episodes, lots of content, and you've got to figure out how you're going to reach your audience and get them to listen. And the other thing that we learned really early on too, by the way, is that, we weren't going to attract non-podcast listeners to become podcast listeners through McAfee Hackable. No, like, the big shows are doing that, right? It's the This American Life and the Joe Rogans and the, all of those shows that have huge, huge listenership. Those people are bringing new listeners in. And so what we decided was that we really needed to figure out where our audience, like who's our audience and where else might they be listening in the podcast world. And so then we did a whole bunch of in podcast advertising to our listeners through those other shows that were aligned with our shows or had similar audience types. And by the way, this was before things got really programmatic in the digital, space for podcast advertising. And so we were really curating lists of podcasts that we wanted to be on, and get awareness of our show on. And so we did really incredible creative with the other podcast hosts, like of Reply All and things like that. And those ads like did tremendously well, and it got people to go from that show to our show. And so you got to fish where the fish are.
Yeah, no, and it's so funny you say that, because I think about that a lot when it comes. It's if they're not already consuming, people aren't consuming podcasts. It's going to be tough for them to find your podcast, right? And so you got to look at the market in terms of, hey, what does it look like out there for who's listening right now? And then kind of to your point, how do we get in front of them, and how do we, bring them to us, right? So, the paid advertising, or the advertising, in podcast advertising is certainly an interesting way. And definitely think that is for me, at least, I've noticed it before where, I hear somebody else's podcast while I'm listening to one that I, listen to regularly. I definitely give that an ad, because what happens or at least add to my list, what happens when, I'm traveling or doing whatever, and I've listened to, all the current episodes of whatever show that, I normally subscribe to. Well, I'm going to look for something else that's kind of in that same vein that, really speaks
Exactly.
to me in that same way. So it's certainly interesting, but I guess, when it comes to connecting with, once you get those listeners, right, you build that listenership. And as far as connecting with the actual listener, I know you talked about kind of, storytelling and that sort of thing.
hmm
You know, how, I guess, using a branded podcast, once you get them listening to the show, what are some effective ways that you've seen that have really enabled, a host or the show to connect with their listeners and really make sure that they're kind of keeping a thumb on the pulse?
Yeah, well, another great question. One of the things that we did is we started an 800 number and let our listeners dial in and leave us messages. And it was brilliant. And we play some of those messages at the end of the show or at the beginning of a show. And so the listeners felt like they really were, contributing, right, to what we were doing. And so that was huge. We really, sucked them in and, asked for topic ideas or let them ask questions to us. We also put backstory content on our website. And so that, engaged them more. It's those things that you need to think through, about where is your customer? Where are they listening? What are they doing? What can we do to help them have a even more enjoyable experience with us? And how do we get them back, to listen to more and more? The other thing I'll say to you, it is about the experience, totally about the experience, but also think about the length of your show too. One of the great pieces of advice we had gotten early on was, keep it under 25 minutes. And so when you keep the episode short, you can binge on a couple, or you can get one in when you're, commuting to work or you're walking the dog or whatever. And so many podcasts, I feel like, stretch them out to be, 45 minutes to an hour long, and you lose people after a while. And we had amazing retention. You can look at our audience data, and these folks are listening all the way to the end,
Hmm.
So that's the other part, is like give them really great content so that they want to come back for more, and give them clues as to what's coming up as well, by the way. You can do that as a tactic too.
Yeah, I'm sitting over here smiling just because it's everything you're saying. It's really kind of almost pulling back the curtain for myself as to why I've loved listening to podcasts and gotten into it is simply because I think about all the times that, I drive to work or whatever, before podcasting was as big as it is, and you listen to the radio or whatever, and
Yeah.
I would find myself changing the channels just to change channels
Yeah.
because after a certain, amount of time, it's just you've
Yeah.
heard the same thing, you're ready for the next thing, you want to hear a song or whatever. So keeping in those short kind of bursts where, people can, listen to it, on demand, if you will, and really keeps their interest and it's not dragging on for too long. It's funny because that's just me and obviously speaks to me as well. But so, I guess I'm
One of
trying to
the
keep.
things, Ben, I'll mention actually about the
Yeah.
show and keeping people's interest is the host and the personalities that you have on the show are also super important. And so one big decision that we made with Hackable is that the host of the show is not a McAfee employee or person. It's Jeff Siskind. And Jeff Siskind happens to be, a really smart, engaging, funny guy. And so that makes a lot of difference too. Like, we found out that our audience felt really connected to him. Like, he made himself very vulnerable on the show. He was like the guinea pig for all of the tests that the white hackers were doing, to see whether or not we should be scared. And so he put himself in this very vulnerable position, and it makes him easily likable and connectable to the audience. Like, they care about Jeff and like what's happening to Jeff and other folks on the show. So I think that's the other part to really kind of keep your show going and listenable, and you know, your membership or audio database coming back to you.
Yeah. And that's interesting, especially when you think of the actual, subject matter that Hackable is actually about. And for the company, that it's for, when you're talking about, security and cybersecurity, generally you think that, hey, it's going to be more serious toned or buttoned up almost. But I agree with you in that that's people want to listen to people who they think they can connect to
Yeah.
or they feel some sort of connection to. I guess when you were doing that, or as you were, starting to launch Hackable, for example,
Mhm.
did you run into, I guess, did you have concerns around that? Did you get any pushback with, hey, we're not so sure that this is going to kind of fit
Yeah.
our tone that we're going for, or how it's going to be
We
received
did.
by?
The client had never done anything like this before. They were, I wouldn't say they were like super skittish or nervous about it, but they wanted to know that, before they actually launched it, that it was doing all the things that we thought it might do. And so we ended up doing research, and we created the pilot episode. We went out to 300 consumers, and we asked them questions about McAfee before they listened, and then we had them listen to the pilot, and then we asked them questions after they listened. And lo and behold, the results were incredible. Like, I called the research company. I'm like, "Are you sure that these are right? Because they're amazing." Like, People could recall the brand, even though we mentioned it only twice in the show. So it was very lightly branded, but they could recall the brand. They had very positive feelings about the content, loving the content or liking the content. And their feelings about McAfee overall, whether they were a McAfee, purchaser or not, went through the roof. Like the McAfee love, brand love, was astronomical. And so the show we knew that we had a success on our hands. And, this was pretty early on when brands were kind of getting into podcasts and doing branded podcasts. And so that research company subsequently had many other branded podcasts come to them and say, can you test our show? And they use the Hackable results as like the benchmark. Like if you can get the results at the same level as Hackable, you have a hit on your hands. And so, it was super impressive. And that definitely allayed any client concerns about the show immediately. And we just went full steam ahead.
That's so cool. That was actually, you brought up another question that I wanted to ask about, but you said, it's very lightly branded. You only mentioned it one or two times, but I guess that's something that, I think about a lot when it comes to a branded podcast is, how heavily branded should it be? But, why do you think having it more lightly branded was almost more beneficial in this instance?
Because I think it's, I think a lot of companies think of their podcast more as like a sales tool versus a gift. And we were thinking of it as a gift to our audience, right? This is a gift to help you be more protected in your life. And so we didn't want it to come across as a 25-minute ad for McAfee. That's not what it is. It wasn't the purpose of it. And so it really it dictated that it was very lightly branded and very successfully lightly branded because it was so engaging and popular.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's wild to kind of think about when, if I tune into something, especially, and I don't think about it until I'm actually listening to it, but, if there's something where it's kind of, like you said, almost like a sales tool, it's kind of beating it into your head, it really starts to throw up those guards and shields, and it makes you say, hey, I don't know, like, I'm just here to listen or to learn, which is what you talked about at the top of the show.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess kind of bringing it all together, what are, I guess, some of the biggest successes or impacts that you saw, especially with Hackable, once you had this successful branded podcast launch? What are some of the things that kind of came out of that, really was important to McAfee?
So I think one, it strategically aligned to what they were trying to do as a brand. So that was excellent and the timing worked really well. It created intimacy with their brand that they didn't really have and way more positive feelings about the brand that they didn't have. I would say, some of the things that we learned that we haven't talked about yet is like, you know, helping your clients or brands overcome the fear of the creative side of it, and don't just say, okay, we're going to do an interview style because that's what everyone else is doing. Like really think about the stories that your brand might want to tell and how do we then, create those stories in a unique way because you're competing against all these other shows out there. You've got to figure out a way to stand out. So I think, don't stifle the creative process. Make a show that your audience is going to love and want to tune into time and time again. I would say bring in experts. Like, and again, I know you're targeted to like smaller businesses that are, doing this really scrappy, but don't feel like you have to do it all on your own. There's lots of options out there. I mean, we used a production company out of Canada that was like, they weren't inexpensive, but there's other production companies that can help you, right? You don't have to do the whole thing on your own. And by the way, when you bring in partners who are experts at what they do, it typically comes out better. And I'd also say, think about marketing and like everything that you can do to support the podcast. And so I mentioned in podcast advertising, but that's not the only thing, like we did all kinds of creative things. We swapped episodes with other podcasts, like Darknet Diaries. We did cross promotions with other podcasts. Didn't cost us a thing or them a thing, right? We're just bartering. Because McAfee has, a mobile product, we put links to the podcast in the mobile product and said, hey, this episode's about fishing, protect yourself, come listen. We used that. We used their website. We used like every channel. We used PR. We used every channel we could, including their own employees, by the way. And this show was so good that we got employees telling us this is the best thing that McAfee has ever done. And so the employees loved it. And they're talking about on their social channels, so the whole thing just like blew up. You have to think about every outlet you have, like every touch point you have. It's not all paid, and leverage it to get the thing off the ground and then don't forget about that, right? You got to keep it going. So you got to continually market every single episode.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting when you think about like the employees getting excited about it too, because they also, I mean, to your point, they all have their own kind of social networks as well that they can share it with. But when it comes to those actual employees, what, I guess, was there like a specific role or specific type of employee where you saw, I guess, a little bit more excitement around?
Well, they were all really pretty excited because McAfee hadn't done anything like this before.
Mm-hmm.
But they had like a group of what they called social champs. So we really rallied around those social champs and gave them, stuff and tools to help them promote the shows. And they did that exceedingly, exceedingly well. And one last thing I'll mention too, Ben, sorry, is
No,
that
you're fine.
the other thing that we did is we really paid attention to the apps, so Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and, we did everything that we could to drive traffic to the apps. And what happened when we did that is we got recognized like, oh, McAfee's Hackable is like trending in our app. And so we got on like, we were the number one tech, podcast. We were in the top like 50 of all Apple podcasts. We got on all these lists and it just, again, like, fueled the flame and just grew like crazy. So like anything you can do to like become noticed in a category is super beneficial too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I want to take your advice and at least, you said 25 minutes or less, which is, I talked about it earlier, so I'm going to keep your advice on that. And I think this is a good spot to end, but, I guess where should people go to learn, more about you and response marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is response.agency. There's no .com, just response.agency. Please visit our site. You can find me on LinkedIn if you just search Carolyn Walker or email me. It's Carolyn, Carolyn @response.agency.
Awesome. Well, Carolyn, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. It was great having you on Recorded Content.
Thanks, Ben. I had a blast. If anyone has any questions, reach out. We'd love to help anyone who's looking to get into branded podcasts.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.